Live on WFLA Now. This is Run for Fun with running enthusiast Leigh Spann.
All right, let's go. Welcome back to the WFLA Now Stream Center for this week's episode of Run for Fun. It's the show we designed, to show you ways to enjoy running and walking, because if you enjoy it, guess what? You'll keep doing it. I'm your host, Leigh Spann. I'm a meteorologist at WFLA in Tampa, but I'm also an avid runner. And this show gives me a great platform to be able to try to convert people into thinking that running is something you get to do and not a chore. So today's episode is actually a little bit different than most. We usually do have a lot of fun. We show you things that can make running fun, but cardiac events in athletes has definitely gotten a lot in the spotlight recently between Damar Hamlin and Bronny James, LeBron James' son, people that we would think young athletics should not be having these kind of events. So joining me today, we do have a host of people. So we're going to start with Dr. Katherine Wojnowich to talk about, she's a sports physician, to talk about what runners and endurance athletes need to know about cardiac events. We also have Bob Stumper joining us. Bob has run for years, but is a recent heart attack survivor. So we're going to hear his story. And of course, joining us, as she does every week, is Coach Maria, about how she deals with heart issues in her clients. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. This is such an important topic. Again, maybe not quite as fun, but we also want to make sure that people are staying very healthy and doing things that can make them live a wonderful, happy life. So we're going to start with Dr. Wojnowich. Tell us a little bit about your background, and then we can talk about what happens to athletes in these situations.
Yeah, so I'm a sports medicine physician over at Bayfront Health in St. Petersburg, and I've been down here for the last, 12 years now. We were just
Goes
talking
by
about
fast,
that.
yeah.
Goes by fast. And so part of my work as a sports medicine physician, I take care of orthopedic complaints, but I also take care of primary care complaints in athletes and athletic populations. And so right now we're in the midst of preseason physicals, which means that we're doing a lot of these pre-participation evaluations for our high school athletes and our collegiate athletes, and then even our professional athletes, where we're doing some of this cardiac screening and trying to evaluate and rule out kind of things that could put people at higher risk of cardiovascular disease. We also do counseling in the office if people have not been athletic before and wanted to start a new activity, or have questions or concerns about their risk factors. We'll work with our cardiology team to make sure that they can engage in activity safely. And so just a little bit of what we do, but really our goal is to get everybody moving and everybody feeling good. And again, having a history of heart disease doesn't mean that you can't be active, but we want to do it safely, and we want to make sure that we're all aware of the risks so that we can kind of advise our patients so that they know their limits and they know when to come see us for additional evaluation.
And let's talk about that, because we'll go back into, why exercising is good for the heart to begin
absolutely.
with. But what would be something that would cause someone to say, okay, this is different than just exercise? I feel different. Why? What would that feel like to them so they would come to you?
So sometimes it can be something as subtle as I feel like I'm putting in a lot of work, but I don't feel like I'm seeing the performance gains I should be seeing. I might be training hard, but I feel as though I'm really fatigued when I'm done with my runs. I don't understand why that is. Sometimes people will actually feel not just that pounding that we all feel when we're running, but actually kind of a skipped beat, or what we call palpitations, or an irregular rhythm. Those can be signs that something more serious is going on. Sometimes people feel a little bit dizzy or woozy after they run. And so those are sometimes symptoms that you might not associate with having a heart attack or a problem with your heart. Also, sometimes people will just really feel that chest pain, and it can be really hard to differentiate, especially right now. It's so hot outside. Am I just short of breath, or is this pain that I'm feeling coming from my lungs, or is it coming from my heart? And so, always, when in doubt, come see somebody about it, right? It is always better to be safe than sorry when we're talking about the heart. I think the really scary thing is that, especially for our younger athletes, sometimes there will be no presenting symptoms, right? And that's always what's so scary for us as physicians on the sideline and our athletic trainers and our whole kind of coaching and care team, is that they may not be complaining of anything until all of a sudden they kind of pass out. And so the other part of that is that, recognition of a cardiac event is really important. And so anytime you're in a group or you're on the sidelines and somebody goes down and it doesn't make sense to you, having that extra index of suspicion to go over there, check a pulse right away, and kind of activate that emergency response system is incredibly important.
And that was what has been heralded so much with Damar Hamlin, that when he went down, that the trainers got out there and they started that CPR so quickly that now, you know, he is back on the field. I mean, this season, it's remarkable. So what tests, if you think that you are fine, like that's, you know, I've never had an issue before, but maybe I want to make sure that I don't have this undiagnosed heart issue of some sort. What is a test that I should ask for from my doctor?
So some of the ways that we can kind of evaluate for risk factors for heart disease include some simple blood tests. And so checking a lipid panel, a cholesterol panel. I have a decent number of patients where they're active, they're exercising regularly, and we do their blood work and their cholesterol is higher than they, you know, it's a surprise to them.
It would be a surprise, exactly.
It's a surprise because you think you're doing all the right things, right? And, you know, I always tell them a lot of times it's genetics, it's not, you know, things that you're eating or doing necessarily, but that will increase our risk, right, of cardiovascular disease sometimes. It may make us want to kind of watch more closely. Another thing that's really easy to do in the office, of course, is an EKG. And so that will look for any signs of electrical abnormalities, which can increase your risk of kind of flipping into a funny rhythm that increases our risk of sudden cardiac death. Or if you do an EKG, sometimes it can show signs of heart strain, so some more subtle signs, and then that would kind of then have us do some additional evaluation, you know, including an exercise stress test or some non-invasive testing that looks at the calcification of the arteries. So those are some other things that we can do if we're worried at all.
So now we'll bring in Bob, because Bob, tell us a little bit about your backstory, that you're an avid runner. You probably were shocked as anyone that you eventually had a heart attack.
Yeah. You know, first off, so much of what the doctor just alluded to and talked about resonated, because almost to the point where I've got, you know, goosebumps on my neck, because it's spot on. And I'll just kind of preface my response to your question with I was one of those athletes my entire life that heart attacks always happened to other people, you know, and bypass surgeries and open heart surgeries, they'd always happen to other people. And as an athlete since I was a kid, and an endurance athlete specifically really since my mid to late 20s, I was diligent about getting my well care visits and checkups every year. And I know I had a family history of high cholesterol, and genetics were, you know, something to be concerned about. But each time I went, it was a little bit of, you know, you're an athlete, you're a runner, you're good, keep going. And you know, I mistakenly, in hindsight, kind of bought into, like, I'm good, I'm an athlete, I'm right. And then that fateful day comes, right? So, you know, quite honestly, one of the big takeaways from my experience was nobody can be a stronger advocate for our own health than us. That's number one. And don't lay that off on anyone else. But, you know, if you'd like, I could go into, you know, what kind of led up to me and how that mindset could be somewhat dangerous for folks if they're not aware.
And, because that's, I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to bring this up is because I think that as endurance athletes, we do think that nothing can ever happen to us. Look, how could anyone be more heart healthy than us?
Yeah. And in my situation, quite honestly, I'd done a marathon, albeit virtual, 2 months before, you know, I had a heart attack. So, you know, you get in denial. And I say that because once we set that mindset of, I'm good, you know, it happens to everyone else, then, you know, I could be running along the trail and a sign will show up like, wow, my watch just gained 5 pounds, my left arm feels really heavy, and you kind of dismiss it, mistake. Or I'm out, you know, coach gave me a 6-mile run this morning, and you're 2 miles out and you're feeling a pain in your jaw, and you're like, nah, not me. And then you slow down, you catch your breath, and then you get to a point where, you know, that your body's telling you and giving you a shot across the bow with, hey, wake up, this is important. And then that one morning where, you go to quarter mile down the street and you can't catch your breath. And it's at that point for me, when it happened, it was August 9th, 2021. It was a beautiful morning and still pig-headed in the moment, admittedly. I said, I'm going to finish. I have a 4-mile run. I'm going to finish it.
I'm going to finish it.
And so I went another 1.5 miles, had to stop again. And, went another 1.5 miles, finished my run, got home, and just was very, very fortunate and blessed that my daughters happened to be around. And when I started telling them, like, hey, these are the symptoms I'm having, meanwhile, I've been having for the past several months, and I just was in denial. And, my youngest daughter just happened to grab me by the neck and rush me to the hospital. And still at that point, you believe it or not, in denial. Where,
how did she know?
Well, she's a lot more tuned in than me. I was, she didn't even say a word, actually. She literally grabbed me and took me to the car and rushed me to the hospital. So she knew right away. And, one of my other daughters was I'm literally trying to Google. I'm literally on the laptop Googling, heart attack symptoms. Is this really happening? And they were goofing on me. They just rushed me in. But anyway, the long story short is that once I got to the emergency room, it wasn't until the emergency room physician happened to locate an EKG that I had in 2009 and came in and said, "You're having a heart attack." And that's one of those moments where you're like, okay, time out. Like, they happen to everyone else. They don't happen to me.
Right.
Like, no, I run 40 miles a week. I just did a marathon 2 months. They don't happen to me. And I guess and I can go into a lot more detail, but I guess the point there that the takeaway is, really blessed to be able to walk away from that situation. And then secondly, advocating for your own health to the point where when you have those symptoms, to the doctor's point, they cannot be ignored. Not to be paranoid, but just athletes, and particularly endurance athletes, and coach does a great job with educating us and raising our IQ around these issues, these body IQ issues, running IQ issues, that when we start to have some of these issues, that something's going sideways, don't wait. Right.
And that's what, like, now looking back, you felt the jaw. Was that, Dr. Wojnowich, is that something, things that I would have never put those two together?
Yeah, so sometimes we'll feel pain that kind of radiates up into the jaw, like Bob said, radiating down the arm, and that heaviness that we feel. Sometimes for women, again, oftentimes actually for women, it will be more subtle. And so just a feeling of like unwellness, you finish and you're like, I just don't feel good, or nausea. And so for women, it can be really challenging actually, because they don't always present with some of those classic symptoms. But yes, absolutely. Anything that just feels off of your baseline warrants an evaluation. All of my athletes are highly attuned, for better or for worse, to many of their musculoskeletal issues, and then we kind of ignore some of the other things. And it can be hard sometimes. You're getting a lot of noise. Everything doesn't feel great when you're running and it's 92 degrees outside.
Yes, right now
and it's
everything
100%
feels terrible.
Right, so everything feels terrible, and so it's hard to say, well, is this just being outside in the heat, or is this something more? But again, it's always better to be safe than sorry. And as a physician, we're always happy to reassure, but it really is very quick and easy to get in, see your doctor, get an EKG, get some basic blood work, and make sure that there's not something that we're missing.
And would you recommend getting one of those as a baseline, like before you have any issues at all, or is that not necessary?
Well, I mean, there are many ways to think about it, right? And so from an elite athletic standpoint, we will often do baseline screening EKGs to evaluate for some of these abnormalities that can be present but have not presented as actual cardiac symptoms. One of the caveats I would say is that you can't take a normal EKG and say, I'm fine, this will never happen to me. Okay. And so it can be helpful for us to compare against over time. But if you get an EKG and it's normal and you're still having these symptoms, the EKG in the moment can show us if there is stress or strain on the heart. If you're having these transient episodes and then things go back to normal, what we would call angina oftentimes, an EKG in between episodes may look normal. And so again, if you're noticing these recurrent episodes and you may have several kind of warning signs, like you said, before you have a major cardiovascular event, that warrants additional evaluation. And so you can't be falsely reassured if something like that screening EKG is normal, but you're having these symptoms.
Yeah, I would add, if I could, I'd like to just add something to that quickly, in that oftentimes, those tests are awesome. To your question about the baseline, having the luxury of hindsight, I would highly recommend it to anyone for several reasons, only because it gives us more awareness of our body and what's going on. And quite honestly, for myself, it wasn't until they did something called a catheterization, and I still remember it to this day, where I was on the table and awake, and they're checking your heart out, and the doctor, the cardiologist who was doing the test, looked right at the technician saying, "He's running with his heart." And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "Shut it down, we're done." And he came over to me, and I was still in a starry state, said, you're having surgery tomorrow morning early for bypass, and your heart is 95 to 100, your arteries are 95 to 100% blocked. And I didn't know, you had no idea. So earlier on that we have the ability to kind of establish that baseline, then we can get a little bit more proactive as we move closer to it. So.
And now I'll bring in Coach, because Coach, it must have been really scary for you to, you'd written him a 6-mile run, and then he went and did it. and then there he shows up, in the hospital a couple hours later.
And I've had a few athletes with heart issues, and it is scary, mostly because as endurance athletes, we are trained to kind of not listen to our body. I try to counteract that by saying, "Hey guys, like, you need to pay attention," but there's so many variables that can mimic that are totally normal. And so, and especially in Florida, when you're running in the heat, if you're running, a little carb depleted, or you're running, a little, the heat can make you nauseous after a run.
Yes,
so
it can.
There's so many things. I think what I would say to my athletes is to always follow your intuition. Number one, usually if something is, and something is really wrong, don't push through that. It's partly why I freak out about the, go hard or go home mentality. I'm like, don't do that all the time. You need to be able to pay attention to some signs. And it's not like if you randomly get a sign, typically that's nothing. But if it's happening over and over again for a couple of weeks, like, you need to pay attention to it, because it's typically something different. And a lot of my athletes run underfueled, too much caffeine, all of that, not enough sleep. All of that can mimic a lot of these signs. And so I always say, go through your checklist. If you have a really bad run and you feel really off, go through your checklist. Did I sleep? Did I eat? Did I have too much caffeine? And if you go through that checklist and you can say yes to all of those things that you did well, then you need to go get it checked out. It needs to be something that you pay attention to and be overly cautious about. It's actually more common in endurance athletes than we think it is.
So, Maria, I know you have access to all of our, we all wear heart rate monitors on our watches now, and you have access to that. But so do we. Is there something we should be looking for when we look at our heart rate data, or do you not think that that's necessarily enough information?
I mean, it's not enough information, only because there's so many variables that go into your heart rate. Like I said, you can have too much caffeine one day and your heart rate will be really elevated. You can be underfueled and your heart rate can be really elevated. You could not be recovered from your last workout and you can have an elevated heart rate. So there's so many, especially in the summer when you're running in Florida, there's no way I would be able to tell. Okay. The only thing that I would say is that if you notice a pattern, if I go back and look at Bob's data, you can see that he was pretty elevated for a fair amount of time. But again, that can be not eating enough fuel, not to recover. So it's not it's very hard for a coach to be able to see that. But you should know your body. We as endurance athletes know our body better than we give ourselves credit for. And if you have an intuition that something is wrong, then you've got to listen to it. Do not push through that stuff. It's better to be safe than sorry 100% of the time.
And Dr. Wojnowich, if someone comes to you and just says, I feel weird, like that's all I would know how to say. Like this, I feel off.
Yeah.
What are the steps going forward when I tell my doctor that I should expect?
Yeah. First, I wanted to go back to Maria's point, just a couple of things. The first thing I'll say is that some of the Apple Watches that are ubiquitous, of course, are pretty good at picking up one irregular rhythm in particular called atrial fibrillation. And so although that does not directly lead to heart attacks, it does increase the risk of heart attacks and can also be kind of a secondary sign of some blockage. And so if your watch is alerting you that you have this irregular rhythm, that may be one indication that you would want to go and see the physician to have an actual EKG to take a closer look. You know, sometimes it'll erroneously alert when you're brushing your teeth or something like that. But if it's something where you're sleeping and, you know, it's on there and it's saying you have this irregular rhythm, that warrants some additional evaluation. The other thing that can be helpful in that what we do when we do an exercise stress test is we actually look to see how quickly the heart rate recovers after exercise, because that can be a very good marker in terms of general cardiovascular health. And so over 2 minutes, like after you've finished your run, over the next 2 minutes, as long as you've kind of, you know, if you're not briskly walking, but you've kind of sat down and you're stretching, something like that, that heart rate should recover about 10 beats. If it doesn't do that, that may be a sign that your heart is under some increased stress. And so if you, and again, the caveat being that right now, while it's quite hot, it may remain a little bit more elevated. But if you notice that after that intense exercise, you know, we want to be able to push our heart hard, but then when we stop exercising, a sign of a well-toned heart means that heart rate immediately kind of goes back down. And so if you notice that, you know, it was in the 150s and now, you know, 3 or 5 minutes later, it still hasn't come down below 100. And typically your resting heart rate as an endurance athlete should be somewhere in the 50s to 60s, if not a little bit lower, then that is abnormal too. And so maybe a sign of overtraining, maybe a sign of illness, right? But something is off with that heart. And so if we continue to push with a heart that is not able to kind of relax after exercise, may induce, you know, a cardiac event.
That is,
I typically don't see, Leigh, because you guys shut your Garmin off when you're done your workout, and then. So that's a very good way to pay attention. Like you guys should, all of my athletes and athletes in general should be paying attention to that resting heart rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something I pay attention to my resting heart rate, but not those 2 to 3, 10 minutes after the workout. Right. I'm like, okay, if the workout's done, you know, the watch goes off, I'm in the shower.
Right.
So I will keep it on and pay more attention to that because, again, I look at the overall resting heart rate, which is nice and low, which can mean a healthier heart, correct? That your body's not working as hard when you're not working hard. But that 10 minutes after my workout, that is not a time that I pay attention to my heart rate. So thanks for that.
So even, you know, if you stop your watch, but it's still typically, I mean, we all have a slightly different watch, but it still typically is measuring that heart rate. Just kind of see what your heart rate is doing as you're drinking your water, right? We're typically not jumping right into the shower. We've got a couple of minutes there where it should progressively decrease. And so if we're not seeing that and you're not, you know, again, briskly walking outside in the heat or something, then that would be something to kind of say, okay, am I overtraining? Am I underhydrated? Am I, you know, like Maria was saying, go through that checklist. And if the answer is yes, then you also have to make some accommodations because you shouldn't be training that way.
Exactly.
And then, right. And so obviously we want to prevent that because a fueled body is a fast body, and fueled in the sense of fluid and high nutrition and also sleep. But also if you're like, you know, I'm doing all the right things, but my heart rate is staying in the 100s and it just will not come down. You know, above 100 is technically considered abnormal, right? And so that should absolutely be brought to the attention of your physician.
So in hindsight, Bob, you know, looking back, did you would you have, if you had known what you were looking for, could you have seen some of these things?
The easy answer is yes. But to kind of piggyback those comments is, as the athlete, it behooves us to kind of go through this process because we're all so locked into it, right? I mean, it's a part of our DNA to go through this process and understand the trial and error. In other words, wow, I don't feel so great today. What is that? And you're smiling because I know you do this.
Yes.
And Coach is adamant about this, is just, all right, so I didn't feel so great today. What did I eat? Am I hydrated? Did I rest? What's up at work? What's going on with my family? Are there other things going on running in that program in my mind that could have an impact on my run? And any endurance athlete gets this because we kind of get into that state when we're out running, so they kind of release a lot of that. But for some reason, if that doesn't happen, or wow, I really crushed it today, what was going on? Geez, I had 100 grams of protein yesterday, and I've got my carbs up, and I'm well hydrated, and everything's just firing on all cylinders. That's the state we want to strive to be in, not just for working out or for being an athlete, but in life in general, in my opinion, is because how do we get there and stay there? But the trial by and error piece of it is to not to get down on ourselves and kick us, right? The key component, the core of all of this is our mindset. That's at the middle of all of it. So that being the case, it's don't beat ourselves up. Is what did I learn?
Right.
So it's even with a quintuple bypass. I'm blessed to be here. Thank you. What did I learn? What can we share?
And you're back out there.
And thanks to Maria,
as an educated heart runner now, right?
Yeah, very much so. And
and he's doing it in the most healthy way possible.
Yeah.
I have a question for Doctor. I often go back and forth on this, and I'd love your opinion on it, because a lot of times as endurance athletes, we think that we are doing ourselves like a favor by running these marathons and stuff. And I mean, there's a lot of research that suggests that doing endurance sports like that are actually not good for your heart, and that running is really good in moderation. And we tend to take that to the next level, and that maybe that is part of the problem. How do you feel about that? And I'm not saying that to be a Debbie Downer, because I love running marathons, but are we not helping ourselves out by doing things, more than moderately?
Everything exists on a bell curve, right? Where too little is not good, and too much also seems to be not good. And I preface this by saying that I also am a distance runner and competed all throughout college and continue to enjoy running. And so, again, is part of my DNA. When you look at long-term studies, the heart is a muscle, and it responds to exercise the same way all of our other muscles do. But part of what the heart does is the main thing that it does, right, is it pumps blood to all of these other exercising body parts so that you can get oxygen there and they can continue to do what they need to do. So when you're asking that heart to pump like a high volume of blood over hours, what can happen is you can develop a little bit of dilation of some of the chambers of the heart. It's called the atria. And so we know that people who have been endurance runners for years are more inclined to develop this irregular rhythm called atrial fibrillation, which I alluded to earlier. Every physician that talks about this is like, I'm not stopping doing this. I accept that this is what's going to happen to me one day because I appreciate all the benefits. And so, that is one thing where kind of over time, because the heart is just pumping more volume through, those atria may dilate a little bit. And so we know that endurance athletes are a little bit more predisposed to developing that AFib. We also know that just the stress of asking the heart to perform, pretty close to maximal effort for several hours at a time, that is, detrimental. If we were to check cardiac biomarkers after you performed, did a marathon or after you did an ultra or something like that, we would expect to see some like leak of troponin, some evidence of some cardiac like ischemia or strain. And we expect that to reverse and recover as you then relax. But, it can cause some kind of reversible damage when you are exercising. And so that's actually why, we will sometimes see these heart attacks present at the end of an endurance event, right? Because you've been asking this heart that's kind of right on the edge to then perform maximally for 2.5 or 3.5 or 4.5 hours sometimes.
If we're lucky.
If we're lucky, right?
3.5 seems real fast.
Everybody's times are different. I'm not trying to.
But is that something that I was just kind of doing a little research this morning? The athlete's heart, quote unquote, the athlete's heart, is that what you're talking about? Like one part, because it has to pump blood so much, gets worked more, basically, like you're using one arm muscle versus the other arm muscle?
Yeah, you can think of it as like doing bicep curls, right? Your biceps should get bigger over time if we're lucky. If we're doing the right weight, then our arms will get bigger, and the heart will do the same thing. It's a muscle, and it will respond to that stress. And so we can see some changes on an EKG, and that is called the athletic heart. That is reversible, and so the way to try to figure out if this is just truly athletic conditioning versus something pathologic or something that would be problematic is to have the athlete not exercise for a period of 4 to 6 weeks, and those EKG changes should normalize. That being said, no exercise is also not good, right? And so we know that it's really important from a heart standpoint and from a general just health and well-being standpoint to move regularly. And I always tell everybody, listen, I know, I'm an endurance athlete and that is what I enjoy doing, but that doesn't mean that's what you have to do. Or like, if you come to see me, that's the only thing that I'm going to recommend. I want you to do something that you enjoy doing, because then you're much more likely to do it regularly. I think, we accept the stress on the heart just like we would accept this, an increased risk of stress fractures if we're training with poor nutrition, or an increased risk of, muscle, right? After we finish some of these races, it's hard to walk the next day. The same thing's happening in our legs as it's happening to our hearts. We're getting a little bit of muscle damage, and that's reversible over time. I think it's more about making sure that you're recovering appropriately afterwards. And then again, like I said, understanding that there are some risks associated with long-term endurance exercise, but if we're managing them appropriately, and again, kind of paying credence to some of those warning signs, it doesn't mean that you should stop exercising.
And I would also argue that.
Go ahead, Bob.
Sorry, Maria. This actually just triggered a thought in my mind. If I can ask a question, kind of a follow-up to Maria's with the physiology of the heart. One of the things that will stay with me forever is the morning after my surgery that I was talking to my surgeon, and he said something to me that stuck with me, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Maybe you can explain. And what he said to me was, if you were not an endurance athlete, you would have dropped dead 10 years ago. And I was like, what do you mean? I had to ask him, like, how does that work? What happened? He goes, well, because you were an endurance athlete, and the heart and the human body is so miraculous, and it does things like nothing else, that your heart, as it was depleting and clogging, figures out a way to pump the needed blood around to the other parts of your body. Even with those clogged arteries, it starts forming new pathways to get that. Is that accurate? Can you talk about that?
So oftentimes you'll form what are called collaterals. And so the body will say, this part of the heart is not getting the blood that it needs. So because that main passageway is blocked. And so it'll go kind of upstream from that passageway and actually form new blood vessels. And so because you are asking, asking the heart to perform every day, and it's saying, okay, I'm not, this guy is not giving me the stuff that I need, right? So I'm going to get it myself by forming these new collaterals. And so we'll see that oftentimes.
Awesome. Body is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And so, and we ask incredible demands of our bodies every day just to be able to do regular things on top of exercising, right? But so because you were exercising and you were getting just a ton of blood flow through the heart, it was able to form these collaterals, like I said, upstream of where that blockage was. And for you, again, it was probably genetic, right? And so when we look at incidence of sudden cardiac death before the age of 35, it's typically in these young athletes where it's so catastrophic. Oftentimes, it's typically a genetic cause. Over the age of 35, it's typically cardiovascular, like atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, meaning that those arteries will kind of form areas that are narrower because they have plaques on them where then cholesterol will accumulate. And so what we worry about is A, that there's less kind of blood flowing through this narrowed plaque, and B, that plaque will actually get disrupted and then flow downstream. You know, you can think of it like if we got a whole bunch of rain, for example, and then it washed a whole bunch of leaves downstream, all of those leaves would kind of collect at the narrowest spot and block blood flow further, or water flow further, right? And so that's where that risk kind of comes from when you've been exercising and then you kind of disrupt one of those clots and it lodges downstream. And so what you may have noticed previous to that kind of main event was just not being able to meet the demand where those arteries were a little bit narrowed, and then you had that final run that maybe dislodged that clot and kind of led to the actual main heart attack event.
Got it. Thank you.
So I'm going to go back and ask my question again. So if I have gone through my checklist,
yes,
and I still am off, what are some of the things I should say to my doctor? First of all, because I think all I would be able to say is, I felt weird today.
Yes.
Is there a better description of what I am feeling? And is there and then what tests, what would a doctor do next?
Yes. So, I mean, I would always say, tell me, open-ended questions, right? Tell me a little bit more about what you mean when I say I feel off. Do you feel dizzy? Do you feel lightheaded? Did you feel like you were going to pass out? Did you feel like your heart was racing, skipping beats, irregular patterns when you checked your pulse? It felt like it was all over the place. Did you feel like you couldn't catch your breath? Did you feel, just kind of seeing those little stars or spotlights, right? Like on the edges of your vision when you stand up too fast, that kind of thing. Tell me a little bit more about what you felt. Did you just feel a heaviness that felt unusual to you? And that can help to guide us, to say, okay, this feels more like heat related, this feels more like it's pulmonary related, or this feels more like it's cardiac related. Again, anyone over the age of 35, I'm going to have I'm in that category too. And so
Nothing wrong with that. You have lots of knowledge.
It always hurts me every day when we talk about older athletes and it's over for 35. And I'm like, well, I don't, really feel that way, but
35 still seems very young.
35 still seems very young, but we know, again, anyone over the age of 35, I'm going to have a much higher index of suspicion to rule out cardiovascular disease. And so that's where typically we'll do a couple of things. We'll check some blood work to make sure there's nothing obvious if you're anemic, right? Or if your protein levels are very low, or if your thyroid is off, can contribute to all of these symptoms, or if your sodium is like 30. Again, simple blood work can tell us all of those things. Also check an EKG to make sure I don't see any abnormalities. And then oftentimes I'll refer to cardiology, and in doing so, I'll kind of set up my patient, typically order an ultrasound of the heart, what's called an echocardiogram, that assesses for just the general function of the heart. How is it pumping? What do the valves look like? And sometimes it can tell us, again, if a portion of the heart isn't getting good blood flow, it'll look a little bit what we call it won't move well, or we can see that atria, if it's dilated, will just kind of be flappy and floppy, and again, so they're very good. It also is very good at evaluating for some of these structural concerns, HOCM, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and echo is typically diagnostic for that once that becomes actually kind of clinically apparent. And so I'll do that, and I'll also typically order what's called a Holter monitor, where it measures it's basically like wearing an EKG, and technology has changed, and so it's actually just a little patch that people wear typically for 2 weeks, and that allows me to see, what does your heart do during exercise? How does it recover? Are we seeing any funny rhythms? Sometimes people will have these when they sleep, and so like the highest incidence of sudden cardiac death is actually kind of overnight and early morning. Due to a number of very complicated physiologic changes. And so it's really helpful for us to see, is the heart kind of going into a funny rhythm when you're sleeping that you may not be aware of. And so that's my typical next step. And I'll typically do those things as I'm working to get the patient in to see a cardiologist. And then depending on those results, we may decide, and depending on what else you've told me, we may decide to, do a stress test of some sort. We may decide to do some of the non-invasive imaging like a coronary calcium CT score. which is kind of like a cardiac catheterization. So allows us to just see kind of plaque burden in the arteries. And then the gold standard for evaluating the arteries is actually a catheterization, but that is somewhat more invasive and so typically reserved for people who may have true anginal symptoms or who may have actually had a heart attack just as you did.
And Maria had a question earlier. Do you remember what that was?
It wasn't a question. It was literally like all of this talk is making me realize why I'm such a jerk about about the levels of stress we put ourselves under, and that I guess at the end of the day, if we want to train our heart to be stronger like any other muscle, we have to take our recovery just as seriously as we take our running. And so many times I see athletes just push themselves too hard, undereat. A lot of them are not hydrated enough, training really improperly, and pushing themselves past the limits that we should push ourselves past and not recovering. And it just reminds me of how dangerous it really can be over the long term. I say this stuff for a reason, and it's not just because I like to hear myself talk.
Dr. Wojnowich, one of our goals as working with Maria is to run for our whole lives. Exactly. So it's not to win this race. Right. It's to run. So that's why she is very adamant about making sure that we're not just out there, bleeding ourselves dry with all, and so what you're saying is resonating with all of us who work with her.
Well, I always tell my husband that I can't wait to, I'm waiting until I am the fastest for my age group. And so that's not going to happen for, a couple of age groups.
You just got to stay this pace.
Correct. I'm trying to maintain this pace until I am the fastest.
I would argue that you can still try to win your age group. Well, I'm going to argue that's a thing you could do.
I'm just saying.
So we know that, people are told exercise. So that any amount of exercise is going to help your heart. We're more concerned with the people who are probably going to listen to this are the people who are already exercising, and is it when it gets too much on your heart. So that's it's really we talk about this a lot on the podcast and show as well, is that some of the things we talk about here don't necessarily apply to your recreational runner who's out there, a couple of times, 2 or 3 times a week. This, yes, they still need to be paying attention to their heart, clearly.
Absolutely.
But we're looking at, we've changed our heart based on what we are doing on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I would say for the recreational runners, sometimes what we'll see is you're getting ready for a big event, right? You've decided that you've gone from, couch to 5K, and it doesn't mean that those things aren't great. We want to encourage, again, everyone to be active, but sometimes those big jumps in physical activity are also in somebody who has predisposing risk factors are also, again, another kind of, that's a big stressor on the body to make that big jump. And so we always encourage gradual, right? Like when you're training for a marathon or a big event, that training log should be, 16, 18 weeks. I mean, it's
a long time.
It's a long time. And that's to help train the heart to get ready for the demands of what you're doing, to train the body to get ready for the demands of what you're doing, right? If you decide that you're going to run a marathon tomorrow and you don't have any base, obviously you're not going to feel great, right? Right. Or you're a superstar, and then maybe you do, but you're not going to finish it. You're not going to feel great. You're going to increase your risk of injuries everywhere, including the heart. And so it's much more about encouraging kind of everyday, gradual activity as you work towards building those goals. And so even patients who are like, I'm going to run the whatever Gasparilla, we'll start training now. I know again, nobody wants to, it's hot, right? I get it. But start training now, even, building a cardiovascular fitness base in a way that is more comfortable, right? If you're not heat acclimated, then start inside, right? Get on the treadmill, get on the bike, even get in the pool, do some aqua jogging. There are many ways to help build that cardiovascular fitness base. And then you can transition. I always say your body needs to see some of the stress of what you're doing, so you can't do all cross training and then decide to run a long race. But, build that cardiovascular fitness base, and then as it gets cooler and you feel more comfortable going outside, go ahead and do that.
One of the things that I didn't mention, and I will now for a minute, is it's kind of a public service announcement for Coach and people that do what she does, and that is, it's really simple. Just being a runner or an athlete my whole life, excuse me, I really didn't learn how to run until I began working with Maria. And and I'll say this now publicly, I mean, her training, her awareness, her guidance and experience had a lot to do with maybe me even surviving this thing, because we began working together in 2015, coach, or right around there. And I didn't, your whole life you're running, but you really don't know how to run. And
Just
so
out there.
we're just touching the surface on so many things that go into this. And that speeds up the learning curve and our running IQ so quickly that, who knows, maybe that kind of training and the way you're going about it and somebody coaching you through it can save a life or somebody else's. And I'm not trying to get too sentimental on you, but it makes a difference.
I'm sure that makes you feel good, Coach.
It does. I always like to see my athletes succeed in any realm, but mostly, as I've always said, I just want you guys to be able to run until you're 90, and I don't want you to trash your body, regardless of whether it's your heart or your hormones or your psyche. I don't want anybody to be, down in the dumps and not able to run when they want to run. Now, sometimes we don't have a choice and we have to take what we can get. But I think, we need to be grateful and careful about how we do things.
So we got a Facebook question. It's more of a statement, but I'm going to pose it as a question. Heather wrote in and said, let's get an EKG for youth sports physicals. Now, do we not do that because it's expensive? Like, why is that not included in youth sports physicals?
So oftentimes for youth sports physicals, that's a community-based event. And so before the high school, in the state of Florida, and every state's different, in the state of Florida, when you are in high school, you have to complete a high school physical form in order to compete in any sort of school sporting event. And so does not apply to club sports, does not apply to children who are in 8th grade, unless you're playing on a varsity team. So that is the first time when people are entering 9th grade, that is the first time that they might be exposed to doing these actual sports-specific pre-participation exams. Right now, and again, this it becomes very complicated. And so I'll try to summarize it as quickly as possible. Right now, because it is a community kind of push, some people may do one of these mass screening events that we oftentimes will participate in. Some people may go to their primary care physician, who is a pediatrician oftentimes, who may not have an EKG available to them. Some people may go to an urgent care center or, a community health center where, again, those resources may not be available. The other thing is that a child's EKG and a well-conditioned athlete's EKG sometimes looks a little bit different. And so there needs to be specific training to correctly and accurately interpret those EKG results. And so those are some of the kind of barriers, is that not every child even gets a pre-participation screening because they may not be in the Florida High School Athletic Association's purview. Also, that not every child may have access to a physician in general at all, and they may not have access to a physician who feels comfortable doing EKG screenings. Now, there is an organization called whoweplayfor.org, and they were founded actually here in the state of Florida, although now they are nationwide, that is really advocating for youth EKG screenings. And you may certainly go to their website for more information there. They're working with a number of local high schools across the state of Florida to try to encourage EKG screenings, to be able to try to identify some of these. The other thing that I'll say is that...
what was the name of that?
It's called whoweplayfor.org.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And so they have a lot of great information, and oftentimes through grants we'll be able to offer EKG screening with remote cardiology kind of overreads to be able to help some of these schools. What I will also say is that not every cause of sudden cardiac death can be identified on an EKG. And even though we have gotten a lot better at being able to interpret some of those changes, we may not see them. The child may have that congenital abnormality, such as HOCM or some of the, left ventricular non-compaction, some of these other things, right? But it may not be evident. And so we also don't know how frequently should we do EKGs. Should it be at every level of training? Typically, at most colleges, we'll do EKG screenings to evaluate. But even then, we don't know, should we do it every year or should we just do it when they enter? So there still is a lot of debate and different discussion about that. You know, I think it is becoming more mainstream, and obviously anything that we can do, because it is so catastrophic when it happens to anyone. And EKGs are relatively inexpensive. It just requires the kind of coordination of care. The other piece of that is that once we do identify an abnormality, that child then needs to follow up with a specialist to be appropriately evaluated and cleared, and may not have insurance, may not have resources if we're in a more rural area, may not be able to get into a cardiologist for 6 or 8 weeks. And so if that EKG ultimately is normal and there's nothing going on, then they've missed their whole season potentially. And so that's not to say that we shouldn't do screenings, but it is oftentimes difficult to kind of coordinate all of those downstream pieces. And so we're lucky here, we're in a relatively resource-rich part of the state of Florida, where we have access to, you know, really great pediatric cardiologists, but there are other places where it is more challenging. And so that has been one of the things. And again, because it is just so sort of scattered.
Well, we have gone very long. I've taken up a lot of your time. Bob, thank you for telling your story. I hope that you continue to thrive out there like you are. I mean, I love that you're back out there. Love seeing you out on the road, knowing what you've been through and that you're nice and healthy. Maria, thank you for helping us stay healthy. And of course, Dr.
I'm trying.
Dr. Wojnowich, great information. We hope that, again, people just listen to their bodies and talk to their doctors. That's sort of, you know, that you're there to listen to us and to try to figure it out.
Exactly.
Thank you, guys.
And trust your intuition, please.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, our goal is always to help everybody participate safely. If you come to us and you have a concern, we're not trying to shut you down. We want to help you, like Maria said, continue to run until you're 90. And so we want to help you do it safely.
Okay. Thank you, guys. We'll see you next Tuesday.
Thanks, Leigh.
Thank you.